The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, will Ontario's EV strategy survive election 2025? Then, what the end of Meta's fact-checking program means for users of the world's largest social network. That's all next on The Agenda. Ontario has ponied up billions and billions of dollars to be the electric vehicle capital of the world. But with the Trump administration's pivot away from EVs and tariffs on top of that, has this province's investment been misguided? Let's ask. In the nation's capital, Brian Kingston, President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. And with us here in studio, Rachel Doran, Vice President of Policy and Strategy of Clean Energy Canada. Josipa Petrunic, President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, and Greg Mordu, Associate Professor in the School of Engineering Practice and Technology at McMaster University and the ArcelorMittal Dofasco Chair in Advanced Manufacturing Policy. Great to have you three back here in our studio. And Brian, nice to have you on the line from the nation's capital. Going to put you to work right away because, of course, we all want to know today how the 25% tariffs on automotive are going to affect this country's industry. Tell us.
Well, tariffs will have immediate and devastating effects for the automotive industry, not just in Canada, but across North America. We have created a North American supply chain through decades of intentional policy meant to reduce barriers, align regulations, and create a totally integrated market. When you put a 25% tariff on those components and finished vehicles that move across the border, it will lead to production losses, potential job losses, and of course, price increases for Americans of these new vehicles. So this is a very dire situation. We're hopeful that there still remains an off-ramp, but if they do go forward, we're going to be in serious economic trouble.
Rachel, one of the things I don't get is if a car is produced in Canada by an American-owned company, but it's going back and forth over the border multiple times with some parts that are Canadian and some parts that are American, how do you know if it's a Canadian product or an American product and whether it gets tariffed or whether it doesn't?
Well, I think it's going to be complicated, absolutely. And you pointed out, a vehicle can go back and forth across the Canada-U.S. border 8 to 12 times. And so, I think, as Brian pointed out, automakers are really, have used that to really leverage an integrated North American market that all of a sudden we're putting kind of a new line across. So, I think how the supply chains reshape themselves is going to be a product which we're watching how it rolls out. But certainly it shows just, the absolute challenge for a market that is used to really operating as one.
What about, for example, Canadian manufacturers? You want to give me the example
Buses?
from buses in Winnipeg?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it might help folks also understand a little bit about what is a tariff, right? It's just a tax at the border, essentially, is what it boils down to. So if you look at something like New Flyer Industries, they make buses in Winnipeg, very important manufacturer. They own most of the North American market. Or Nova Bus in Quebec, they own most of the rest of the North American market. If part of that bus, let's say the axle and let's say the powertrain are partially designed in Winnipeg, then it gets to the border and it's hit with a tax, pretty much a 25% tax on that portion that was made in Canada, goes off to the factory in the United States to get packaged up with the rest of the component parts, say a motor, a battery pack, or a diesel engine. And then that gets packaged up and sent back over the border back to Winnipeg for the rest of the bus to be put on top. Well, that particular item, at least a component of it, was hit with a tax when it crossed the border at least once, which means when the bus comes back to Winnipeg, a company like New Flyer has to decide, do they swallow that loss, that 25% hike, or do they pass it to the customer? Now, it probably won't be a full 25% hike because the whole thing might not be taxed. It's just that part when it crosses the border. But somebody's going to have to pay for that, and that means usually with transit buses, taxpayers end up getting more expensive buses pretty much overnight. The other danger there is if there's retaliatory tariffs. So if the Canadian government does come out hard and fast and strong as they do and say, listen, when stuff comes back over the border, we're going to slap it with some taxes too. Well, then that powertrain and those component parts, when they come back over the border to get to Winnipeg, get hit with another tax.
Greg, this sounds nuts. Is it?
Well, of course it is. But, and Brian's absolutely right. I mean, we've built up these integrated supply chains since 1965 and the Auto Pact, and we completely changed our automotive industry at that point in time. But the auto assemblers and the automakers have been going through an enormous process of trying to figure this out and their contingency plans. And they'll be looking at where do we get these RX 400s or 450s that are built in Cambridge, and where else can we get them? And the issue is not can we make vehicles in the U.S. They can make vehicles in the U.S. How do we avoid the tariffs? And so they'll be going through all kinds of hypothetical machinations. Can we build these? Can we supply the U.S. from Japan and pay 2.5% tariffs instead of 25% Canada? Can Canada divert its production from going into the U.S.? Can it divert it and send it to Europe, where the plant in Japan might have used to have done? So those are long-term decisions. They don't happen overnight, but that's what we're into now.
Well, let me ask Brian about that. Do you think there are meetings happening as we speak at the Canadian auto manufacturers thinking about how they can, I don't know what, avoid going to the States and do business in Europe or Japan instead?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, auto manufacturers are notorious for having extremely efficient supply chains and having multiple contingency plans in place. All you have to do is look back to the Ambassador Bridge blockade to see the amazing efforts that auto manufacturers went through to divert trucks, use other modes of transport, and keep plants open. Remember, every hour a plant is down, a line is down, you're talking about millions in dollars in costs. So they will be doing everything possible to determine what could be done to avoid the tariff. The one challenge, though, with the Canadian industry is we are so deeply integrated north-south because of the USMCA and the Auto Pact. So the ability to suddenly change your manufacturing and say, you know what, we're going to send this to Europe or Asia, very, very difficult in the near term.
So, Greg, I gather that's why the government of Canada has decided to delay the imposition of tariffs for, what is it, 2 or 3 weeks or something like that, in order to give our supply chains a chance to refigure things?
Well, they're going to need a lot of time to refigure things. In 2 or 3 weeks we'll start it, but they've got, you know, our automakers don't necessarily look at labor, for example, as a variable cost. Some of them do, but a lot of them look at it as a fixed cost. We've got these people, we've got 5,000 people, we've got 10,000 people, and how do we keep them busy? And how do we keep them busy in the context of tariffs that could add up to as much as $5 billion a year if you're making 500,000 vehicles a year, and we do have a manufacturer that makes that. Toyota, for example. Toyota will make about $10 billion a year globally or more. They're not going to eat $5 billion out of their Canadian assembly plants. So how do you mitigate that? Do you ramp it down? They have a big commitment to their people, but how do you keep that commitment going for 4 years, 8 years, whatever?
Can I raise something, though? I mean, we are talking a lot about tariffs and counter-tariffs and tariffs and counter-tariffs and how to mitigate and circumnavigate that. But there's a whole other component to this that we can't lose sight of. A president's powerful, but not so powerful that they can just rip up any agreement and Congress has no say and nobody else has any other say. There are courts, and more courts when it comes to fair and free trade. So one of the components that I would imagine is occurring in terms of the discussion in the boardrooms, or it should be, certainly it should be happening in Ottawa right now, is taking it to the courts. CUSMA has Chapter 31. You have the ability of state-to-state negotiations and adjudication. We might say, well, Donald Trump doesn't believe in that. Donald Trump could have a stroke tomorrow. We have to understand, is it the Republican Party and the entirety of Congress that also is going to ignore the adjudication process? So we need to start that process, state-to-state adjudication, and basically suing the Americans for what they're doing. Secondly, within CUSMA, we have a Mexico-Canada arrangement that we negotiated. If I were Justin Trudeau or Pierre Poilievre, but especially Justin Trudeau, I would be having a pied-à-terre in Mexico City right now with President Sheinbaum, and basically identifying how the two periphery countries under the labor agreement under CUSMA can start to get together and form an alliance of things that we can negotiate together. And the third thing that is in there is corporations can still sue governments under CUSMA. Something we don't like, because we don't like it when companies sue us and taxpayers. But every company can, in fact, sue the American government through CUSMA and through the WTO. So we still have that capability as state-to-state negotiations and adjudication. We have the ability to form an alliance with Mexico under CUSMA, and we have the ability to take it not only to the WTO, but also have our corporations sue.
Let me ask the overarching question then, and Rachel, I'll start with you on this. Liberal governments, conservative governments, federally, provincially, they have all invested billions upon billions of taxpayers' dollars in this sector, in the EV sector, because they've made a bet that this is, what did Gretzky say? Go where the puck is heading, not where it's been. They think this is where the business is going. Are we still, today, in light of all of this tariff nonsense, as bullish on those decisions as we once were?
So, just to raise the context up, 10,000 feet here, there has been, as of 2024, $2 trillion invested in the energy transition globally. A third of that investment has been in electrified transport. We've seen investments from automakers globally reaching the $1 trillion level. Not all that money is out the door, but it's just to put in context, even if we're seeing a slow in south of the border around electric vehicles, that is not necessarily the direction of travel for the rest of the world, where we're already seeing major uptake and year after year growth of electric vehicles globally up to 25%. So, best case scenario, of course, that we're talking about here today, we try to find a way to, continue our partnership with the United States. But a lot of people are looking around in Canada and saying, well, what's our backup plan today? And I think a clean growth plan, it's really important to then double down and think about how is Canada going to be involved and continue to leverage its competitive advantage and look for new opportunities. We need to continue to follow the rest of the world. We can't just stay with where the U.S. is going blindly. We need to have, kind of consistency.
Well, let me ask Brian about that. Should we still be as bullish on these billions and billions of investments in the EV sector as we once were in light of this tariff war?
Absolutely. This is the direction that industry is going. This is the most promising technology. And as you just heard, billions, if not trillions of dollars is going into this transition. So there's no question about what the end goal is here. But absolutely what we're going to see in the near term is a slowdown in EV adoption. We are seeing a reduction in consumer incentives, ongoing charges with or challenges with charging infrastructure. This is slowing the transition, and a lot of the forecasts for EV uptake in the United States, in Canada, they have come down from the very bullish forecasts that we saw 2-3 years ago. But no one is questioning that we are moving toward electrification. What we're not clear of right now is what will that pace be? I think it's safe to say that 100% EV by 2035, as Canada had established, was never realistic. That's a total fantasy now. That's not going to happen. But that doesn't mean that we're still going to see massive amounts of electrification. And look, I encourage anyone, if you haven't been in an electric vehicle, try it out. The driving experience is fantastic. And like any technology transition, once you get over those barriers and people are exposed to it, they will see that this is a superior product.
Greg, your view on that?
If you're in the business of electrification of mobility, or if you're in the business of generating support for the auto industry, of course you're going to be supportive of the incentives that were provided. But the reality is, we committed as Canada $42 billion, Canada and Ontario and Quebec for that matter, $42 billion for battery plants worth $19 billion. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, we wanted to be number one in the world. That's why we did it.
Well, we are going to build the batteries that we're told to build in the volumes that we're told to build using the processes that were generated outside of Canada, in Korea, in the US, in Germany. We are not building an electric vehicle supply chain in Canada that is start to finish. We just aren't. We've paid an enormous price. Frankly, $42 billion could have bought you Stellantis, probably could have bought you General Motors, which has a market cap of about $50 billion. Ford has a market cap of $55 billion. Honda has a market cap of $40 billion. We could have bought any of those companies, and I'm not suggesting that we should have, but I'm just trying to give you some context of what we paid for. So Volkswagen, with a market cap of $50 billion, we're prepared to give them $17 billion for a single battery plant. It doesn't make any sense what we've done. We could have said, okay, we're spending money. We could have built 20 brand new hospitals. Those are important for Ontario too. we overpaid.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
I don't disagree with you, Greg. Are the investments inflated and overpaid, especially in the hype of Mr. Champagne going around the world and attempting to attract these investments? Yeah, probably, definitely. And if you look in that list, I mean, there's money going into Lion Electric Bus, which is declaring bankruptcy now, right? So you can nitpick in there and say we probably could renegotiate some of those elements and do it behind closed doors. But in terms of public facing, is it in the right strategic vein? Absolutely. So Doug Ford is right to come out and say basically we're staying strong in these investments. Now, behind closed doors, maybe renegotiate some of the inflated investment into corporate welfare. But on the front end of it, investments into this supply chain and critical minerals, especially around the Ring of Fire, are we right to articulate that this is the way of the future? Yes, because I have no doubt what is underpinning Donald Trump's regime of activity right now is access to those critical minerals.
Rachel, should we second guess the EV bet we've made?
So we did a study in 2022 before any of these gigafactories were landed, really highlighting that this could be a huge opportunity for Canada. There are, massive shifts in global supply chains happening around the energy transition. We saw the U.S. south of the border play big in the Inflation Reduction Act and kind of set the table stakes. It's like, here's what's going to take to attract investment. Canada, leaned in. I think in our study, we really, to Greg's point, highlighted the value of the EV supply chain overall, and that maybe there's a big boost for Canada's GDP and jobs by investing in things that may not be quite as flashy. It might not be a gigafactory. It might also be just the processing of critical minerals, trying to do the upstream things before it actually gets to the battery production. Battery plants, though, are a big attractor of jobs and GDP. I don't think we are in a position to comment on individual deals, but I would agree to the trajectory of we need to be thinking about a clean growth plan in Ontario and how to leverage the competitive advantage of clean electricity, talented labor, and critical minerals. And that's why Bloomberg, in addition to connection with the U.S. market, ranked us #1 for battery supply chain potential in the world in 2024. I think this is an economic opportunity it would behoove us not to turn our back on, but try to think again about how to get the best benefit for Canada.
Okay, but Brian,
Can I?
yeah,
Hi,
please.
Challenge.
I actually wanted you to jump in on that. Yes, indeed.
I want to get the facts clear on the supports that have been put forward to attract these automakers. The overwhelming proportion of government support is through production subsidies. And what that means is the government, to match what the U.S. had done in the Inflation Reduction Act, where the U.S. is subsidizing every single battery out of a plant, the federal government with Ontario put in place a similar program. And to be fiscally responsible, they had to assume that these battery plants will be producing the maximum number of batteries. And that's how they calculated the size of the production subsidy. There is no chance, given what we're seeing right now in the EV market and all of the trade turbulence, that these projects will be producing at maximum capacity. So that $40 billion number that you're hearing quoted is not remotely realistic. These subsidies will be far, far smaller. And not only that, if President Trump tears up the IRA, which he has said he will do, the subsidies go away. So I think it's really important that people realize that the amounts being quoted are far less. And if you look at the long-term benefits of these plants, this is good for Canada.
Greg wants back in.
Well, the reality is the production incentives. I don't think anyone's going to say that, oh, this was a great deal because we didn't make very many batteries. And that's essentially what Brian is trying to say, that we have about $8 billion in capital investments. We have another $7 billion or so in making whole on taxes, because we tax incentives in Canada. They don't tax them in the U.S., and this is all keeping us full and fair with the IRA. And then another $30 billion or so if the production happens. So the best thing that's happening out of the slowdown in electric vehicles, and Rachel will not agree with me, but the best thing that happens is, as Brian says, we are not going to meet those requirements on production incentives, but they are going to be billions and billions of dollars. My number of $42 billion that I've come up with assumes that they're going to operate at 75% capacity, and they're going to come online a year later than originally promised. It's a lot of money, and I compared the $15 to $17 billion for Volkswagen, for example, with the $1 billion that it typically would take across North America to land an assembly plant. And the spin-off benefits of an assembly plant are much, much greater than the spin-off benefits of a battery plant.
Can I put it in comparison, though, perhaps, Greg? Because, I don't disagree that corporate investments sometimes balloon into corporate welfare, and we don't always get that ROI. But if we speak as Canadians, and in particular in this context of what do we want to keep here, dangling here in the industry, and also have as a negotiating tactic against the Trump regime and in terms of negotiating down into the future. If we take a look at this right now, as Canadians, we spent over $30 billion building a pipeline to support the export of oil. A pipeline that was supposed to cost under $10 billion, ballooned over 30. We had no problem as Canadians buying that pipeline, struggling still to sell it off, but buying that pipeline to export an important product.
And keep Alberta happy.
And keep Alberta happy and keep Western Canada roaring. Was it the best investment? Maybe, maybe not, but we did it, and it has served as a backup now to us. In terms of the strategic play that I think Brian is raising, also yourself, Rachel, is the industry is most certainly staying its course. So while personal passenger cars have dropped off recently, a bit of a logarithmic plateau, if we look at heavy duty, there is no city in the European Union that has stepped away from its decarbonization goals. All buses are going zero emissions, battery or hydrogen. Trucking is going zero emissions by public sector mandate or by bans and by congestion charges. Governments are decarbonizing their fleet by 2030. All corporate fleets in Europe have to be zero emissions, right?
Inexorably going in one direction.
The strategy is there, right? So let's negotiate around the edges to improve those deals, again, behind closed doors, but walking away from them at this crux would hand over to Donald Trump an industry that he's angling for.
Rachel, you want in on that?
I mean, I think that there are, I would echo a lot of what's been said here. Like, we need to stay the course. Ontario, the auto sector is an incredibly important part of Ontario's economy. So the benefits of electric vehicles are, one, economic for Ontario and the production, and two, for the household. So there's no time like the present to be thinking about the energy security of using your own electricity, which is domestically produced and actually is proven to save, drivers over the lifetime cost of their vehicle. So electric vehicles is a benefit for Ontarians to drive and a benefit for the economy to produce. The exact details of, again, an individual deal, the more important piece is how do we keep a foot in the door of this massive energy transition investment.
Well, you won't be surprised to hear all four political parties, the main parties that are represented in the Ontario legislature, have some ideas on that. Sheldon, if you would, middle of page 3, we're going to do just some bullet points here on what the four main parties are saying. The Progressive Conservatives, after years of economic decline under the Liberals, so they say, our PC team has fought hard to rebuild Ontario's manufacturing sector and bring back good jobs with $45 billion in new investments in the first electric vehicle and battery plants in the country. To protect Ontario, boy, we're hearing that a lot lately, Doug Ford needs a strong 4-year mandate from the people that outlives and outlasts the Trump administration. Okay, how about the official opposition NDP? New Democrats will not only keep Ontario's electric vehicle commitments, but will also build on that progress to create and sustain new auto jobs in a thriving EV market. If the worst hits, we will be ready to take care of our people with a strong income protection program. As your next premier, I will support a smart, tough, and unified tariff response that hits back hard. So says Marit Stiles. Bonnie Crombie and Ontario's Liberals will diversify our economy to insulate ourselves from market changes. Yes, we will stand up for auto workers. Yes, we will support the EV sector. But unlike Doug Ford, Bonnie Crombie won't put all of your money in one basket, leaving our economy vulnerable and our workers at risk. And finally, the Greens, they are strong supporters of Ontario's growing EV industry. The investments need to be accompanied by credible measures that make it easier and affordable for people to buy and use the EVs we produce, like purchasing rebates and expanded charging infrastructure. We will continue to fight for a strong Made in Ontario EV strategy that puts people and workers first. That's what the four main parties have to say about that. Greg, what do you like about what you just heard?
I don't like much of what I've heard, frankly, for the same reasons that I communicated 5 minutes ago. The reality is the U.S. has put the IRA and the incentives on pause. And on pause probably means on long-term hiatus. So if what we're trying to do is not poke the Donald Trump bear, we don't do that by saying we're going to double down on our investments that we made in the sector. If The government of Canada has said if IRA disappears, we're going to pull back from our investments as well. That's the responsible thing to do. They shouldn't have gotten there to start with, but that's the responsible thing to do now. However, if Doug Ford wants to keep his multi-billion-dollar investment, he's going to have a lot of trouble. And he's going to have a lot of trouble with the perpetuation of the tariffs in the U.S. It's going to be all the difficulties that Brian have communicated and exacerbated over a longer period of time.
Let me get back to Brian. You've heard what the four parties have to say. What do you like? What don't you like?
Well, I'm encouraged by the commitment to the sector in the auto industry. I think everybody recognizes how important auto is to Ontario's economy and the fact that it creates good, well-paying, largely unionized jobs in the province. The only thing that concerns me is there does seem to be a belief that somehow the PC government has gone all in on electrification only. Not the case. We have a very diversified automotive sector. Yes, we've secured some major investments into battery plants. We've got Windsor that's retooling to electric, Cami building an electric truck. But we've also got gas-powered vehicles still being built in Ontario, and Premier Ford has been very supportive of that. So it's a diversified auto sector. And flexibility is going to be the key as we go through this very choppy transition. You need all powertrains. We're going to need efficient gas-powered vehicles. You need plug-in hybrids, full electric, the full suite. So I'd like to see a little bit more understanding of that by some of the parties, that this is a diversified industry, and the current government has, in fact, supported all of those investments.
Josipa, your feedback on what the four parties have to say.
Yeah, we'll definitely get rid of the EV incentives. There's no need for that. That's wasteful tax dollars into the incentivization people to buy cars. The rising oil price alone, with tariffs or not, drive people to smaller vehicles, smaller engines. They always have, they always will. Let's rely on that. But in terms of staying the course, I like what I'm hearing about staying the course publicly around electrified vehicle investments, but more importantly around manufacturing investments, because you have to give market signals. We're in the emergency room situation. We're not in the ICU yet. So in the ER, we're trying to stop the bleeding. At least the parties right now are recognizing you stop the bleeding by giving market signals of stability. But Greg, to your point about the U.S. is going to rip up the IRA, yeah, they are. Why? Because it's Biden policy. Do I think for a minute Donald Trump and the Republicans are not going to come swinging back with industrial policy that equally invests, if not more, into their pet projects? Not for a minute. They're going to come swinging back with industrial policy, not called the IRA.
Call it something else.
Sounds like something else. The Donald Trump Wonderland, whatever they want to call it. Industrial policy is going to come swinging back. And we don't want to be swinging away at a moment when we can tweak and use the scalpel rather than the axe, as Obama said. We can tweak those agreements, line ourselves up, keep the market signals where they need to be. And the last thing I will say is the diversification. Nobody's mentioned hydrogen here, but to their great credit, I mean, the Ontario government did come out with a hydrogen strategy. Lots of provinces have. To the discredit of every province so far, almost no money has gone into a hydrogen strategy of significant sort that would build out that industry. We have hydrogen producers here. There are zero emissions vehicles as well, zero emissions energy production. It is the kind of investment that would actually securitize a niche market in the province as well.
Last word to Rachel.
So a few points on diversification. Batteries are the largest growing clean energy technology. There's going to be markets in stationary battery production as well. It is not even just the EV supply chain. And south of the border, we're still seeing places like California and 40% of the U.S. auto market still fighting to keep mandates headed towards auto vehicle, electric vehicle uptake. So we can expect to see some uptake south of the border. 50% of U.S. citizens polled said they were open to an EV in the next 5 years. So there's going to be some organic demand there. In terms of domestically, encouraging to hear, some conversation around the supports to help Ontarians benefit from this. We're seeing Dodge Charger EVs produced in Windsor, and the only places you can buy them in Canada are Quebec and BC. Because there's policies there helping support uptake, we see uptake getting up to as high as a quarter and a third in those jurisdictions, and it's because EVs, they do save people money over time, so helping people just deal with the upfront costs so they can benefit from long-term savings is actually a household affordability measure, in addition to the emissions benefits, which can be up to 90% of the life cycle emissions of a gas-powered vehicle. So there's a number of layers of benefit here, and I think, definitely interested to see all parties leaning into both growth of the battery industry, but also clean growth in general, and looking for some of those surrounding supports as well.
Good. I have time left to ask my director to bring up a four-shot of all of our guests so that I can thank them all. Brian Kingston in the nation's capital from the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. Rachel Doran, Clean Energy Canada. Josipa Petronic. Q-Trick, you call it, right? Q-Trick, Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, and Greg Mordew, McMaster University, where he's got the ArcelorMittal Dofasco Chair in Advanced Manufacturing Policy there. Great discussion, everybody. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Meta recently announced plans to end its third-party fact-checking program in the U.S. in favor of a community notes model, similar to X. While the company argues it is moving towards more speech on its Facebook and Instagram platforms, critics see it as cozying up to the Trump administration. What does this move mean for users of the world's biggest social network? Has big tech now overly politicized social media? Let's ask. In Montreal, Quebec, Taylor Owen. He's the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communications and founding director of the Centre for Media Technology and Democracy at McGill University. In London, Ontario, Carmi Levy, tech analyst and journalist. And here in our studio, Bree McEwen, Associate Professor in the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information and Technology at UTM, the University of Toronto, Mississauga. And Aaron Kelly, CEO and co-founder of Advanced Symbolics, Inc., and it's good to have you two here in our studio, and to our friends in Points Beyond, thanks for joining us on TVO tonight. Carmi, going to put you to work right away. It was on January 7th that Meta announced that they were going to end fact-checking on their platforms. What, in effect, does that actually mean?
Initially, it doesn't mean a whole lot, certainly not in Canada, because this applies in the U.S. only, but it will have global impact. What it means is that the company is making official what we've long suspected, is that they want to get out of the fact-checking and content moderation business, that they don't want to be put on blast by Donald Trump in his second administration, as they were during the first, and that they're telegraphing, they're essentially repositioning the company to align with the political winds that are now blowing in Washington. It's pretty clear that this is part of a broader trend, that big tech in total has been moving in that direction, long seen as the opponents of Donald Trump. Now they've been making pilgrimage to Mar-a-Lago, and now the White House essentially meeting with the president, making sure that they are on the same side, and that over the next 4 years they can expect favorable political treatment, perhaps supportive legislation for their business. So that's kind of what we can expect. Is really, this is, if you're the CEO of a company, that's what you do. Your primary accountability is fiduciary. You adapt your policies based on the context of your current business. The politics are changing. The business has to change as well.
We did reach out to Meta for comment, and here is what they said. Sheldon, you want to bring this up, and I'll read this out loud for those listening on podcast. We are beginning with rolling out community notes in the U.S. and will continue to improve it over the course of the year before expansion to other countries. Building a community will take time. There are no changes in other countries at this time. Okay. Taylor, what should we infer from all that?
I think it's true. They never really wanted to be in the content moderation or fact-checking business to begin with. And I think it's worth looking back at why a lot of these programs were rolled out to begin with, which was a reaction to some real challenges on the platform that we saw, particularly in the 2016 U.S. election, where the political winds at that moment were going in the opposite direction. The political winds were insisting that these platforms take their role as overseeing our public sphere, our digital public sphere, more responsibly. And in response, Meta at the time hired apparently 20 to 30,000 fact checkers or content moderators, I should say, started training an AI to do some of this work for them. But I think in retrospect, really that was reacting to a different political moment. And we're clearly in one where taking down those guardrails is not only something they might want to do, and I think probably always wanted to do, and now they're sort of being enabled to by the political moment, but also something that's going to have another big effect on how we all experience our digital lives.
Bree, what was your reaction upon hearing the end of so-called fact-checking on Instagram and Facebook?
Well, it's only the end of fact-checking in the U.S., right? They've been very clear that in the European Union, they will not end fact-checking, and that's because they have to comply with the European Union laws. So the question for Canada will be, do we end up like the European Union and sort of with the Digital Services Act, or are we sort of the U.S. model, and whatever they want to appease Donald Trump with is what we end up getting. So fact-checking, though, has been a challenge for companies. And I would say the content moderation team at Meta and the fact-checking team have been different. They've had independent fact-checkers. But when people get fact-checked, their response is not, oh, I should look into this information and see what quality it is. They are like, I'm being censored, right? Fact-checking isn't censorship. It's actually adding more speech. But people generally feel that way. We don't know about how community notes have really played out in X because we don't have independent access to data from X anymore. But we do know that in smaller communities, community moderation can work much better than a fact-checking system, right, adhering to the social norms. But Meta's problem is that they are not a small community. They are a large network with a lot of diverse viewpoints within everyone's individual newsfeed. And so they haven't really explained how their community note system is going to handle the different context that they're working in.
Let me get you to follow up on that, Aaron, the community notes business, because millions of people may be on Twitter, or X, excuse me, but at the end of the day, they're actually not a huge part of the population, and maybe people don't know what community notes are. So what is that?
So community notes is somebody posts something, and then you can write like a note, like a little tag that's appended to the post that says actually, so let's say what it's most frequently used for, what I've seen it most frequently used for is like an e-commerce outlet is saying, hey, buy my doggy blanket, right? And it'll be shipped to you in 2 days. And people saying, actually, I ordered from this company and I didn't get it for 3 months, and when I did, it was poor quality. And so it's comments on e-commerce or something that somebody posts. So it's not the same as responding to the post. It's a tag to the post, sort of like a little that you can read.
And are they usually helpful?
I think they're helpful, but it's not really an answer to mis and disinformation. So if I can sort of add to what everybody else is saying, I don't think this is a political decision by Facebook. It's a business decision, as others have said. And honestly, I don't even think that Facebook has been doing a good job on fact checking. I mean, you can argue that. And I don't understand why we're leaving it to the networks to check themselves. We don't do that in television. We don't do that with advertising. We have Ad Standards Canada, which is a third party that looks to make sure that people are upholding ad standards. Yes, it's funded by business, so we can get into all of that. We have the CRTC for radio and telecommunications, which has famously decided it's not going to regulate the internet. I think this is the government abdicating its responsibility to monitor these networks. The technology exists. You don't have to be in the platform to monitor it. In fact, technically, you can monitor it better from outside the platform. There's all sorts of reasons for that because the algorithms are trained in a certain way, and it's very hard to have competing algorithms on the same network. We won't get into a technical discussion, but it can be better done outside with a different algorithm. So I don't understand why Elections Canada is not, for example, making sure that we don't have mis and disinformation during elections. That's their job. And as we move to a federated model, which we've already done, so Mastodon is federated, I can put my own server, which Mark Zuckerberg or nobody else has any control over. I moderate that server, and I can bring all of my crazy friends onto that server, and we can do all sorts of things. And it's a direct connection. So the government has to start monitoring this itself.
Let me pick up on that with Carmi, because if I wanted to be a smart aleck, which I'm not, but, well, every now and then, I might conclude by saying, apparently we still care about facts in Canada and the European Union, but they don't in the United States, which is why they're not going to fact check anymore. Now, would that be a wrong inference to draw?
No, I don't think it is, because let's face it, it's pretty clear the platforms which are largely American-based and global footprint don't want to be in the business. Who would want to hire 20 or 30,000 content moderators? Who would want to build the infrastructure, create the algorithms, build the AIs that will monitor this content in real time, build a data center that can actually handle that kind of compute capabilities? And so, no, they don't want to be in the business, and there isn't legislation in place in the U.S. that compels them to do so, nor is there in Canada. So So, I mean, I think it applies on both sides of the borders. It just doesn't fit the business model of big social. And if the government is going to give them a free pass, hey, let's get out of this and save ourselves the expense. Oh, and by the way, look good in the eyes of the current president, then hey, let's go. And so I think that's really where we're at now. Here in Canada, I wouldn't trust the government to deploy any kind of technology. We all remember Phoenix Pay. We all remember COVID Alert and, all the apps that the government has tried and failed to deploy at Cadillac or Porsche level prices without actually delivering what they promised. And so technology is not something that Ottawa does well. And I think certainly on this scale, to ask them to use algorithms to monitor social media platforms and discern misinformation from proper legitimate information and then act on that, I think that's way too tall of an order for a government that, can't even figure out how to pay its own people. So as much as I'd like to see that happen, really don't see that happening in our lifetime, without any kind of major investment in technology capacity at a government level.
Aaron.
So I think there's different ways that we can do the monitoring. I think that's our first problem. I think getting into a situation where we're looking at everything everybody says, that makes you China or Russia, right? It makes you a surveillance society.
1984.
Yes, but there's other ways, and I think that's where we have to have a discussion about how else could we detect mis and disinformation. So as an example, we know from research that mis and disinformation actually travels through the network differently. So what do I mean by that? If you were to create a community of alt.right, alt.left, many different communities, and then you have a general population sample, if misinformation comes out or egregious information comes out, it will travel more quickly in those other networks than in the general population, because the general population will say this is nonsense, right? And so when you see something traveling differently, then you flag it. That's going to reduce your costs a lot more than reading everything everybody says. And we don't want to be reading everything everybody says. So I think there are cost-effective ways. I wouldn't say that we should set it up like Phoenix. I think it's a third-party agency. Ad Standards is not part of the government. It's a separate organization that does monitoring on behalf of, that following the legislation. So there's different models to do it. There's different methodologies. And I think some are better than others. But we're not even having that discussion. We're just leaving it to people to police themselves. Nobody in the country polices themselves, not even the police.
At the end of the day then, Bree, is there anything more to this than this is Meta trying to suck up to Donald Trump?
It is a lot of that, but I think there are so many threads that are going on here, and for TV's sake, I'm going to pull out a few of them. One is that Meta doesn't like being in the content moderation business, but if you get out of the content moderation business, you're still moderating what content is available. And so they have always been in this position of reflecting the societies that they exist in, and having to think through how their algorithms influence the way people see the world around them. So when they change from something like fact-checking to community notes, they do have an influence on how we see the world around us. But I think that this particular moment, the changeover in leadership at Meta, the 6-minute video that Mark Zuckerberg did, and the changes to this particular strategy shows us that Meta, out of all of the large social media companies, is in the awkward position of having taken the President of the United States offline at the end of his last term.
They did do that.
And I think the tell in their statement is that how are we going to say people can't say something online when someone can say it on the floor of Congress? And they're telling us that in the American government, people are saying things that are not true. We don't want to be in the position of having to be the one standing up and going, that's not true, because that's a politically difficult position for them. That is a difficult business position for them as they deal with regulation. And so instead of doing that, they're switching to this community note system so that they don't have to fact check anyone. And then they can say, if a community note comes out, oh, we didn't say that. The community decided. And so Meta is able to put this little bit of remove between themselves and U.S. politicians who may not be telling the truth or wrapping things in a kernel of misinformation in a way that will allow them to say, it wasn't us. We're just delivering the speech that people want.
Let me switch from Facebook to TikTok here. And Taylor, I'll get you in on this one. Trump came to TikTok's rescue. which is a very odd thing because, of course, he's been, talking a lot of smack about China lately. So what's in it for him here? What's going on?
Well, a few things seem to change his position. I mean, one was a very large campaign contribution by someone who has a real financial stake in the future of TikTok after which the day later he reversed his position on the ban. So let's be perfectly clear.
I'm sure
about
that
what's
was a
driving
complete
that.
coincidence.
A total coincidence that, but in addition to that, I think he saw the political power he had on TikTok through the election. He saw a political constituency in a younger demographic using TikTok. And now, with his proximity to the U.S. tech sector, I think he sees a real financial and geopolitical opportunity for Americans to take ownership in this technology that previously was largely controlled by China. So there's a bunch of things at play here. And at the end of the day, whether we should ban or not TikTok was a real conflation of very different constituencies. People who had concerns about the mental health of kids, people who were worried about device addiction, people who were worried about national security, people who were worried about data privacy. They were all sort of aligned to a certain degree for a moment on banning TikTok. But those are very different political constituencies that just, in the end, I think couldn't hang together here.
Carmi, what's your prognosis on whether, I know he's the most powerful man in the world, but can even the most powerful man in the world force the Chinese owners of TikTok to sell half their company to somebody in America?
Well, it's interesting because there has been movement on that front. Originally, the Chinese government said, no way, no how. They will not allow the company to be sold. They would not allow their proprietary technology, the algorithm, to fall into anyone else's hands. And they wouldn't even consider the conversation. Whereas now we're seeing reports that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, they are having internal conversations about who they would like to have buy the company if it comes to that. And of course, Elon Musk's name has risen to the top of that list. And so Donald Trump has already, to a certain extent, achieved that end. And he's kind of moved the Chinese government's position to the point that they would consider either a complete or a partial sale without the algorithm, allowing whoever buys it on the U.S. side to craft a new algorithm and incorporate it into the platform. And so I think we've already seen movement there, but we also need to remind ourselves here that this isn't about ideology. This is all about getting out of content moderation because it costs it money. It doesn't care about politics. All it cares about is keeping us engaged on that platform and serving up as many ads against that. And ultimately, that is their business. And if they can do it more cost effectively by not getting involved in all this messiness in the geopolitical space, this gives them a very convenient way out of it. And at the same time, it lets them be buddy-buddy with the current administration.
Let me go back to Taylor on this. Do you think that's the play at the end of the day, which is that this was Trump's way of delivering half of TikTok to a guy who gave him $250 million during the campaign, namely Musk?
I mean, it's not impossible at all. And it's certainly a reflection of a new alignment between U.S. tech power and U.S. political power. I mean, this is pretty unprecedented what we're now seeing, and it's not just on TikTok. It's going to mean a very aggressive pushback against any country or region, in the case of the EU, that tries to regulate American tech. I think we'll see the real deploying of American political and geopolitical power to push back against anything internationally that's seen as not being in alignment or in the interests of U.S. tech. And that's a new moment. And I think in Canada, too, we need to come to grips with that. We're in a very different political place with this new constituency that's sitting around him in the White House.
Let me do one more follow-up to you, Taylor, because I know you got a heart out and you got to get going on to something else. So we're grateful for your time here. But tell us, you say Canada's got to get a handle on this. Do we look like we are?
I mean, on the digital file, it sure would have been better if we had passed our Online Harms Act, which could have dealt with a lot of the problems we're talking about in a very efficient way before the election of Donald Trump. I think our internet would be far safer and we'd be much more aligned in a more secure position in alignment with Europe on our regulatory policy than we are now. I think it's going to be very difficult now for any new digital governance to come into play that isn't seen as being aligned with U.S. tech interests. And that, to me, ultimately is a question of our sovereignty. Are we able to regulate Canadian democracy in light of a real push from American oligarchic and political interests that want to push back against our own ability to regulate our public sphere. And I think that's the question we're going to be faced here in the next 3 and a bit years, almost 4 years.
They're not oligarchs, they're broligarchs. Let's get it right here, okay? That's the new expression. Taylor Owen from McGill University, thanks for joining us. You better scoot if you're going to get to your next thing on time. Thanks for joining us on TVO tonight. Okay, well, let's pick up there. Bree, do you want to pick up on that? This notion that you know, holy smokes, governments and tech giants, I mean, this is going to be a perpetual struggle from now until whenever. Everybody's trying to get the upper hand. How's it looking to you?
Well, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, the rumor is, really did not like being called an oligarch. But I think that might be where we are. And I think that when we think of the Canadian context, we're already looking at Meta not really abiding by Canadian laws, right? So we said, hey, you have to pay news content to be able to run that on your news feed, which having high quality news sources on the news feed is a way to help with misinformation and the overall information environment. And Meta said, you know what? No news links for you, Canada. Yep. I was trying to have a conversation with someone in the States the other day, and I said, oh, actually, here's this news story. And I realized I couldn't post it. I couldn't have the evidence for that argument. And so if we think about that being a source of Canadians getting information, we really have a not great situation within our Meta news feeds and the content that we're getting. And so that is the question for Canada. Can we make laws that these large companies care about on our own? Or will they just say, okay, well, we'll just take our ball and go home, in which case we may need to think about aligning ourselves with the European Union or aligning ourselves with the US, whichever way that plays out and whichever way we think is appropriate for Canadians, because we might not have the standing to just do it on our own.
That's a good question. How do you see it?
So first of all, I don't think Meta is a news platform. You know, when we say a news platform, it's an advertising platform. That's what it is, okay? And its algorithms are there to find audiences for your content. So it's great if you're a small business, you've opened a Mexican restaurant, and it makes sure that all the people who like Mexican food, who live in your community, see it, and it's fantastic that way. That's when it works really well. If you're an anti-vaxxer, it finds all the people who are anti-vaxxers and shows them your anti-vaxxing theories, and that's how it works. It's an advertising platform that seeks out the audience for your content. So it's not a news platform. It's not a fact-checking platform. It was never designed. We don't ask advertisers to be balanced in their advertising.
But there are lines they can't cross.
Exactly. And who keeps those lines? Ad standards, not the advertisers. The advertisers had their way. They would just say, my sugar cereal is the healthiest thing you can eat, okay? They wouldn't, you know, and so... And they're not balanced. Our ads aren't balanced. We don't say my cereal will make you fat and your teeth rot, but it's delicious. I mean, we just say it's great tasting.
But there is something called the Ad Council that's supposed to keep an eye on them.
There is, and we need, my point of view is we need a council similar to that. I think we can have our sovereignty. What Mark Zuckerberg doesn't want is to be in the fact-checking business. He doesn't mind if the government, if Elections Canada says, you know what, there's misinformation here and it's telling people to go to this polling station, they shouldn't be, it's over here. He's not going to have a problem with that. He just doesn't want to pay 30,000 people to listen to every conversation so that he can catch what everybody says something wrong about the election or about vaccines or what have you. Yeah. Like, I want to put out there that they do some fact checking. We haven't seen any animal torture videos on social media, and it's not because people don't post them. It's because we all agree that is disgusting and gets flagged immediately. It's when you get into this gray zone, and I will add that let's take it outside of social media for a moment. Remember the university presidents last year who had to resign because of anti-Semitism in the States. And they gave very lawyerly answers, which is, I don't know what I have the jurisdiction to do here. Can I kick this student out of university because he's protesting the Gaza war? I don't know, right? And a lot of people don't know. We had a trucker protest in Ottawa a few years ago. I'm from Ottawa. 3 weeks of horn honking, torture, and people saying, get these people out of there. Oh, well, they have the right to protest. Is this a protest? I mean, they have the right to stand on Parliament Hill. Do they have the right to honk their horns all night? So we don't know as a society what people's rights are and where your rights infringe on my rights. We really don't know that yet. And it's not just in technology.
A couple of minutes to go here. And Carmi, I want to, let me give you the responsibility of explaining to us the introduction of AI characters on Facebook and the significance thereof. What's that about?
Because Facebook is not growing like it used to. It is aging out. Young users don't use it. So the demographics are significantly older than any other platform. And so they have to find a way to keep the size of the network growing. They have to find a way to maximize engagement. And you're certainly not going to attract more humans to your platform now. So you create AI accounts that look and feel just like a human account to drive engagement and give advertisers a reason to pay the rates that they're paying and convince them that, yeah, we are going to get you in front of a very large audience, even if some of that audience is not necessarily human. That's what this is all about. Is it's a dying platform. We are reaching the beginning of the end of Facebook and other platforms like it, and they're finding all sorts of creative ways to make sure that they can keep the money spigot on for as long as they possibly can before the whole thing runs out of gas.
In your view, is that kosher to do that?
Not even remotely. Morally, ethically, I mean, certainly there is no law that says it's illegal because the laws are way behind the bleeding edge of technology. But morally and ethically, if I see content or any kind of asset that's synthetic and it's not labeled as such, and I'm led to believe that I'm interacting with a human, that's dirty pool. And so the company will say, oh, well, we've put a label there. But if it's tiny and in the corner and I don't really notice it and I'm being duped, I think we should have a moral and ethical conversation around that. And ultimately what it's doing to us. Why are we even engaging with platforms like this in the first place if this is the kind of game they're playing to make sure that we stay on it as long as possible? Not really where I want to go. And quite frankly, when I first joined Facebook, it isn't what I signed up for.
Last 30 to you, Aaron.
And that's not new. China has been putting synthetic users on Facebook and not just that, all the social media platforms, clicking on ads. They've been clicking on, because companies pay per click, so running up their tabs, and they're not getting any sales. We've been seeing this for a long time, and all the platforms know it's been happening. So unfortunately, anybody can put that on there and game these networks, and it really is buyer beware for the companies who are paying per click to make sure they have a system. And again, it's monitoring, and don't expect them to monitor themselves, to make sure that there's integrity here. I don't think the networks can do it themselves. That's my last 30 seconds.
There we go. My thanks to Carmi Levy in London, Ontario for joining us. Carmi, always great to have you on our program. Bree McEwen from UTM, Aaron Kelly, Advanced Symbolics Inc. Thanks so much, everybody, for being on TVO tonight. And that is the agenda for Monday, February 3rd, 2025. A reminder, we've got 2 editions of the On Poly podcast during the writ period, Fridays and now Tuesdays as well during the campaign. So John Michael McGrath and yours truly will bring you the latest developments from the hustings in our Tuesday edition tomorrow. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.